Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager and Public Programs Coordinator for the National Archives Museum. Today's noon author talk is being presented in conjunction with our latest exhibit, Making Their Mark, Stories Through Signatures, which features original signatures from our nationwide holdings. These signatures illustrate the many ways people have placed their mark on history, from developing a signature style to signing groundbreaking policy into law. The story in these records, many of which have never been seen by the general public, of famous and infamous individuals, are all part of our nation's history, and each one made their mark on the American narrative. The exhibit will be open until January 5th of 2015 and is located in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery, 2 levels above us on the main exhibit level. As a reminder, I hope you will be able to join us on Wednesday, September 17th at 7 p.m. for an evening discussion for our annual Constitution Day program. The State of the Constitution: Is the Constitution Still Working for America? This program will be moderated by Akil Reed Amar. In keeping with the Constitution Day theme on Thursday, September 18th at noon, Robert Say will be on hand to discuss his book, America's Forgotten Constitutions: Defiant Visions of Power and Community. To find out more about these and our other public programs and exhibits, please take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the racks out in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is Lincoln's Gamble: How the Emancipation Proclamation Changed the Course of the Civil War by Todd Brewster. Mr. Brewster has served as Donnie Ackerman Director of Oral History at the United States Military Academy, West Point, and is a longtime journalist who has worked as an editor for Time and Life and as a senior producer for ABC News. He is a co-author with the late Peter Jennings of the best-selling books The Century for Young People, and In Search of America: The Century was a #1 New York Times bestseller. As the director of the Center for Oral History at West Point, Brewster built an unprecedented online video archive containing the oral history of soldiers from World War II to Afghanistan. As the center's director, he also served as executive producer of Into Harm's Way, a 2011 documentary on the lingering shadow of the Vietnam War. The center has received acclaim from documentary filmmaker Ken Burns and author Sebastian Junger. Its scholarship on the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq has been cited by Foreign Affairs. A noted commentator on constitutional studies, Brewster has served as Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at Wesleyan University and as Knight Fellow at Yale Law School. He is also the director of the Peter Jennings Project for Journalists and the Constitution, an annual fellowship based at the National Constitution Center. Brewster has written for Vanity Fair, Time, Life, The Huffington Post, The Philadelphia Inquirer, and The New York Times. Please join me in welcoming Todd Brewster to the National Archives.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here, to see all of you in the continuing interest in the Civil War. To add to the promotional message of a few minutes ago, Akil Amar, who's speaking on Constitution Day. Is that right? Constitution Day, September 17th, is a good friend of mine, a wonderful lecturer. He's a Yale Law School professor, and it's well worth your coming out to hear him. He's a delight to hear. One of the first comments I get from people when I tell them that I've written a book about Abraham Lincoln is, "Really? Is there anything left to be said about Abraham Lincoln?" And it is true. Lincoln is the most written about person in American history. According to WorldCat, which is the online library catalog, there are 23,274 books and second and third editions of books written about Lincoln, including some of these. The Life of Abraham Lincoln for Young People, told in words of 1 syllable. The Personal Finances of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln and the Coming of the Caterpillar Tractor. And first published only a decade ago, The Physical Lincoln, including the following chapters: lips, gut, skull, muscles, skin, eyes, height, brain, and my favorite, the homeliest man I ever saw. So what is left to say about Abraham Lincoln? Even the UPS man, knowing that I was writing a book about Lincoln, paused as he was leaving my driveway recently and said, "That's great, but if you're writing this book now, don't you basically have to write again what everybody's already written? I mean, does the story really change? In your version, does he survive the assassination? And if not, why are you doing it?" I listened to him very carefully. Then I told him to get off my property and never come back again. But the truth is, he was right. There are no new facts to bring you about Lincoln, only new interpretations of the facts we already know. And so it was not the discovery of a long-lost letter or a telegram that prompted me to write this book, but my persistent feeling, you could say my frustration, with the storybook image of Lincoln, the one that has rendered him out to be a legend, a larger-than-life figure, and my belief that making him out to be this way, we have done him a distinct disservice. Just as he's been done a great disservice in some admittedly fewer interpretations where he appears not at all like a god, but a self-serving racist whose early and sensational death on Easter weekend, nonetheless, obscured the less noble aspects of his character, his mistakes and selfish impulses, his overtly political nature, his obtuseness, his real preference being not for immediate emancipation, but for a future where the South was still practicing slavery well into the 20th century. Indeed, Lincoln told Douglas, Stephen Douglas that is, in their celebrated 1858 debates together, that a phase out of slavery, its ultimate extinction, could well take 100 years or more, which would have meant slavery up until 1958, the time of Elvis Presley and Eisenhower, Little Rock and Brown versus the Board of Education, what he referred to as God's own good time. Of course, this is hard to imagine. Slavery was dying a slow death, Lincoln or no Lincoln. But it is stunning to think of the great emancipator speaking in such a way. Who knows if he really meant it, or if this was just another example of his overtly political nature. Still, in such statements and many others, many contained within the period of this book, he is not the sharp beacon of moral clarity that he has proclaimed in so many memorials, but a man of many faces, rendering him changeable, unreadable, possessed of a countenance that morphs to greet the moment at hand, hiding what he truly believed, whatever it was that he truly believed. My preference is to see the good and the bad in Lincoln. He was, after all, a man, first and foremost, flawed, inconsistent, self-serving, given to bouts of cowardice as well as courage, incompetence as well as brilliance. And I think you find in reading my book, Lincoln's Gamble, the title is important, that all of this is acutely exhibited in what is perhaps the most turbulent, tumultuous is the word I use in the subtitle, 6 months of his presidency, of his life, 6 months centered around the issue for which he is best known and remembered, emancipation. And over the creation of what is almost certainly, and I say this here in the home of the National Archives, the third most important document in American history after the Declaration and the Constitution, and that, of course, is the Emancipation Proclamation. A document written by our most literary president, but which contains no poetry, like we hear him recite in the Gettysburg Address, and no great phrases for the ages, like those etched into our consciousness by the second inaugural. No identifiable elements like we find in the Declaration, all men are created equal, or even the Constitution, we the people. But instead, a very careful, tightly written document phrased in the language of a contract, with all the poetry historian Richard Hofstadter once said of a bill of lading. My book, Lincoln's Gamble, begins with a carriage ride on July 13, 1862, when Lincoln first mentions the Emancipation Proclamation to two close cabinet members, Seward and Wells, and ends with the signing of the proclamation on January 1, 1863. In between, we watch Lincoln at work on his first draft, sitting among the clerks in the War Department telegraph office, scribbling on a piece of foolscap. Do you know why it was called foolscap, by any chance? Because the manufacturer had a little dunce's cap on the watermark on the paper back in that time. And playing with the spiders crawling across a window. We witness him reading his first reading of the Emancipation to the members of his cabinet, who, recognizing that the war was going badly for the Union in 1862, urged him to put it away and wait for a moment less desperate to issue it upon the next Union victory, whenever that might be. Then, paradoxically, at least in tone, we see Lincoln greet a delegation of black leaders at the White House with the express purpose of encouraging them to begin a migration of the black race out of the United States and back to Africa or South America, anywhere but the U.S. For, as he told them, you and we are different races. Even when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the white race. And we listen to him go even farther when he blames their presence for the war which has already claimed tens of thousands of lives. We discover Lincoln, an agnostic most of his life, or at least a scientific rationalist, in a spiritual crisis where he, a lawyer, begins to doubt the power of reason to affect outcomes and turns instead to a God who works in mysterious and unknowable ways. For God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet, he writes. We watch him actually deny the emancipation to a group of clergymen who visit the White House in September, even as the very document lies in his desk drawer. And then here, too, he goes further, insisting that emancipation would not simply be wrong, but a foolish act, like the Pope's bull against the comet, a reference to Pope Calixtus III, who, upon seeing the apparition we now know as Halley's Comet, thought it an omen of ill will towards Christians and took the futile gesture of issuing an edict or a bull excommunicating it. With Antietam, we see Lincoln finally getting his long-awaited victory, qualified though it is, and at quite a price. September 17, 1862 remains the country's worst day at war, with 23,000 casualties and twice as many deaths as were suffered in the entire Mexican War. 4 times the American losses in the invasion of Normandy, all packed into one September day, what we call Constitution Day now, ironically. As he promised the cabinet, Lincoln finally issues the very document he has just denied, but only as a threat, declaring that he will emancipate the slaves if the rebel states do not put down their arms and return to the Union, whereupon he continues to say that if they do put down their arms, they will be granted the opportunity for a gradual, compensated phase-out of slavery with no conditions or time limit, months, years, decades attached to it, and that, of course, all efforts will continue to colonize persons of African descent to other lands. We watch him lose support in the midterm elections, fire his recalcitrant and Southern sympathizing General George B. McClellan, and then discover that his replacement is more incompetent than McClellan was disloyal. He begins the steps towards a new, more brutal, less forgiving kind of war, one that attacks the civil society as well as the army, assured by his legal advisors that the freeing of the slaves can be legitimately seen as part of that very method of battle. Then, in his December 1862 annual address to Congress, Lincoln reverses his approach yet again, never mentioning the proclamation, and instead offering out constitutional amendments guaranteeing compensation to those states that agree to gradual emancipation plans extending to the year 1900. And if those states taking advantage of such an offer should take the money and then readopt slavery, all they have to do is repay the money they received. Who is this man? To be fair, there were considerable obstacles to Lincoln's authorship of the Emancipation Proclamation. For one, there were the constitutional issues. Could the slaves be freed without a constitutional amendment, and if so, under what power of Congress? They were, after all, property, at least in the legal sense. Even if Lincoln found that notion abhorrent, and the Constitution protected private property from government taking. Yet if not as an act of Congress, how is emancipation to be realized? Certainly an executive order would be beyond the powers of the president, but not, Lincoln decided, if such an order were issued as furtherance of the executive's war powers. And that is what he chose to do. For Lincoln, then, the Emancipation Proclamation had to be written with great care to emphasize this power and only this power. The ironies were rich. If he freed the slaves as an act of military necessity, its justification was not moral, but strategic. None of the usual Lincoln poetry about the evils inherent to one man serving as a master to another, none of this had any place in the document. Since military strategies are by definition provisional, to be lifted once the mission is complete, emancipation, as Lincoln was writing it, could only be temporary. Then, too, as an act of war, freeing of the slaves for reasons of military necessity could only be done for the slaves in the Confederate States, in the states actually in rebellion. Since there was no military necessity to free the slaves in states that were not in rebellion, Kentucky, for instance, and Delaware and Maryland, or even in those parts of the states in rebellion where the Confederacy had already surrendered, those slaves would be left in their shackles untouched by the proclamation. This meant that as he sat working in the telegraph office, Lincoln, a man history admires for his profession of moral absolutes, was authoring a document of astonishing relativity. Freedom for a time only, and only for some, not all. There's more. For Lincoln, the idea that somehow after centuries of slavery, the black and white races were going to live in a post-Civil War world in harmony was simply ludicrous. He was not optimistic. As convinced as he was that an end to slavery was the right thing to do, he feared that it could lead to a servile insurrection with slaves turning on their former masters, or masters turning on their former slaves in an act of pure genocide. This was the impulse of his zest for colonization, this feeling that there was no future for a biracial America. I'd like to read you a few excerpts from the book, if I could. The first one, let me set it up, is after Lincoln has shown terrific frustration with McClellan, his general whom he describes as being captured by a case of the slows, as you may remember. A man who could train an army terrifically, but who was poor at executing. As I describe him, a man who knew the lines to the play, but couldn't walk onto stage for stage fright. So he decides to go down and confront him in the Peninsula Campaign, at the end of the Peninsula Campaign. In early July, only days before the funeral of Stanton's baby, that was the baby of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, for whom they were riding in that carriage ride to the funeral of. A peeved Lincoln had boarded the steamship Ariel out of Fort Monroe and journeyed to visit McClellan at his Harrison's Landing, Virginia headquarters along the James River. The purpose of the visit was to spur the morale of the troops involved in their disappointing peninsula effort. On that, the trip was a success, the soldiers cheering the presidential visit in competition with the sounds of cannons fired in a show of enthusiasm. But Lincoln was also there to confront McClellan on his lack of success. The president had been pained by the Army's failures, and it was taking a toll on him. He was losing sleep and had lost interest in eating. "I cannot take my victuals regular," Lincoln had said when pressed on his increasingly gaunt appearance. "I kind of just browse around." The setting had its own presidential significance, having been the ancestral home of William Henry Harrison, the 9th president of the United States and one of 10 pre-war presidents who had owned slaves. Harrison, it was later rumored, also fathered several children with his. The property had since passed on to others who abandoned it when the war broke out, leaving the elegant Georgian mansion that was the centerpiece of the estate to be crowded now with wounded and dying soldiers. 2 rooms, Harper's Weekly reported, were reserved for amputations. Lincoln toured the ranks of soldiers, doffing his hat in respect to them. As grave as the scene must have felt, the pairing of the 2 men was also somewhat comic. Little Mac, as his soldiers affectionately called him, was striking in his crisply ironed uniform, his mustache carefully trimmed, his chest puffed out in a display of patrician arrogance. Next to him was the shabby but towering Lincoln, 6'4" before you added his trademark stovepipe hat, riding in on horseback like a pair of tongs on a chair back, in one soldier's description. Unusually self-conscious, especially around men of arms. The 2 of them engaged in a stare-down, a stare-up for the diminutive general, over policy. McClellan thought Lincoln his distinct inferior, which he was if you looked only at the birth status and formal education, while Lincoln thought McClellan some stunted genius, whom Lincoln had been too quick to favorably judge when he pointed him to lead, and how he was suffering for it now. McClellan, whose self-esteem was once described by a writer in Harper's as swelling to elephantitis proportions, decided here at Harrison's Landing to educate Lincoln with what the general proudly described to his own wife as a strong, frank letter. McClellan felt forced by conscience, he said, to counsel the president, even if such advice did go beyond the scope of his duties as an Army officer. Lincoln was used to McClellan's imperious pronouncements. Nonetheless, this statement had to leave him startled. In the letter, McClellan laid out a defense of the kind of warfare he preferred and had been practicing: cautious, limited, between armies alone, not citizens, and conducted with decorum, a gentleman's war. Fearing that doubts over his progress were leading many in Washington to push for a more aggressive approach to the South, the general asserted that victory should only be pursued according to the highest principles known to Christian civilization, which to McClellan included a prohibition on the confiscation of property, on political executions of persons, and on forcible abolition of slavery. None of these should be contemplated for even a moment, he wrote. Military power should not be allowed to interfere with the relations of servitude, either by supporting or impairing the authority of the master. It was not only advice, but an attempt by McClellan to demonstrate his preeminence among the Union's senior officers and reclaim his, quote-unquote, rightful position as general-in-chief. McClellan was always an officer who kept one eye on the troops and the other eye on his destiny. Lincoln read the letter as the two sat on the deck of the president's boat. Then, in what must have been the most pregnant of pauses, Lincoln placed it in his pocket and said nothing more other than to coolly thank his general for providing it to him. The two men emerged from this private scene to mount their steeds and slowly greet each division of weary soldiers. Lincoln's awkward handling of the horses' reins brought great amusement to the troops. They had suffered mightily, with 1,734 dead and 8,066 wounded, their regimental colors, the New York Times reported, torn almost to shreds by the balls of the enemy, but having their president there to thank them was a tonic. On the way home, Lincoln's ship stalled, going aground at Kettle Shoals in the Chesapeake, and the president took the opportunity for a bracing dip in the river. The water may have cleared his mind, but if so, the respite was temporary. For only days after his return to Washington, Lincoln rode with Wells and Seward to James Stanton's funeral, and both the relative privacy of the situation, a small carriage, 3 men with a lot on their minds, and the nature of their mission, attendance at a baby's funeral encouraged Lincoln's resolve. As he bounced along in the rain, the president's reactions to McClellan's demanding message no doubt competed with memories of Willie, that's his son who had died in February, and with thoughts of the morbid scenery formed by Washington's dead and dying, of the general downturn in the prospects for the Union, of his wife's slide towards insanity, of the bitter rivalries among the members of his cabinet, and increasingly of his own rising insecurities to push him towards a monumental decision. Rejecting McClellan's advice in its totality, Lincoln abruptly informed his companions that he determined he would utilize the power of the executive order to do what his enemies had long claimed he would do, but which he, torn between highly regarded principles that competed inside him for preeminence, had mightily resisted. His mind was now made up on all aspects except timing. He was ready, he said, to free the slaves. I thought I'd also skip forward to the moment when Lincoln introduces the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So he writes it first to the cabinet. He reads it first to the cabinet, one version. It's the version he's been working on in the telegraph office, sitting there scribbling a little bit, talking to the other telegraph clerks and keeping up on the news of the war. He reads it to the cabinet. Particularly Seward responds by saying, no, wait for a moment when the war is in a better position, when the Union's in a better position with respect to the war, and then issue it. And he feels he has that with Antietam. So this is the moment later on when he then turns to the cabinet for what will be published as the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Who knew if the subtleties that Lincoln did bake into the preliminary proclamation, those intended to diminish as authoritarian rhythms and those aimed at bleaching all reference to moral purpose, will be recognized and after that appreciated? Such carefulness gave the proclamation an aura of mystery and even disguise, as if Lincoln was hiding something behind his tightly wound prose, which he was. Lincoln, who had spoken out forcefully against slavery for decades, had just authored a proclamation of freedom without mentioning the most forceful reason for doing it, which was that it was the right thing to do. Just as odd, he had written a proclamation ostensibly removing 4 million people from bondage, yet among his greatest concerns was that he, in his own position of power, not be seen as acting undemocratically, as forcing his will on others, even as there was no denying that he was indeed acting undemocratically. And this from the same man who in Peoria in 1854 had quoted the Declaration of Independence not only for its expression of the equality of all men, but for its expression that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The whole situation was like one of those Russian nesting dolls, with this irony encased in another irony, and that inside one more. Yet it was also possible, or was it also possible, that there was for Lincoln no irony. For if we are to believe the 1862 date that Hay, his Secretary Hay, applied to Lincoln's meditation on the divine will, then it would be reasonable to determine that Lincoln had become less assured about the moral issue, that the moral issue was his to argue, and instead reduced his ambitions to a simple recognition that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. Would that be so unusual an interpretation when he had started off this day by saying that God alone willed this act of his, this proclamation, that he, Lincoln, was only responding to the mystical sign of the Almighty that had already been shown to him? By this point of view, the argument for the Emancipation Proclamation was not a moral one at all. It could only be as a war measure, as a way for the contest that God willed, for whatever reason that he willed it, to continue until he willed it to end. Whatever was going through Lincoln's tortured mind, those in the room with him seemed to recognize that they were part of no ordinary cabinet meeting, that they were witnessing a historic moment that could be the opening salvo of a second American Revolution. Absent the Jeffersonian flourish for words, this proclamation was as brave a gesture as the Declaration of Independence that had inspired it, for as with the Declaration, no one knew what would happen next, whether this bold expression might be the saving of the Union or lead to its certain destruction, whether it would render them heroes for their courage or autocrats for their brazen and unwanted use of authority. Wells reflected privately on the extraordinary exercise of power he was witnessing. He called it arbitrary, despotic, though not in a tone of objection. This unprecedented exhibit of executive power, he acknowledged, would never have been attempted but to preserve the national existence. Still, like others in the room, he thought it unlikely to shorten the war. If anything, it would lengthen it. There was little probability that the rebels would accept the terms and cease their hostilities. And now, more than ever before, the North's mission was what so many in the South always thought it was, thought it secretly was, and what so many in the North increasingly felt that it rightly should be, providing emancipation to the slaves. No matter the obfuscation of the president's public statements or the destiny of his legal prose, the war was now down to its essential issue. And finally, I'd like to read to you one last excerpt, which goes to the moment before Lincoln, on the night when Lincoln actually signs, the night before Lincoln actually signs the document, which would be New Year's Eve, 1862. Along with his making the final edits on the proclamation, Lincoln spent New Year's Eve day occupied with other executive business, and there was plenty. He signed a bill admitting 48 counties of Western Virginia into the Union as West Virginia, but as part of the agreement, the new state had to adopt a plan for gradual emancipation. Lincoln prepared to meet with his top general, Ambrose Burnside, knowing that he would have to tell him that he had lost confidence in him, that junior officers from Burnside's staff had come to complain about him, and that he was ready to request that Halleck personally review all of Burnside's future plans, a humiliating situation for any general, but especially one who had just been shamed in battle. That would have been Fredericksburg. Lincoln came to an agreement with entrepreneur Bernard Koch for the resettlement of 5,000 former slaves on the coast of Haiti. No matter what he would do by morning, Lincoln had not given up on colonization. He also met with a piteous old lady of genteel appearance, that was Lincoln's own description, who had been evicted from her home by the War Department and no place to go. Lincoln dashed off a note to Stanton asking him to look into the matter. Then, as night fell on the streets of Washington, Lincoln went to his study and paced. Robert Lincoln later told a friend that his father stayed up this entire night. Why the younger Lincoln waited decades to reveal this tantalizing fact is unknown, but if true, what a cinematic scene it suggests, especially from the vantage point of 150 years of history. There's Lincoln, our mythic Lincoln, whoever that Lincoln may really be, alone in his cold, dark study in what was likely the first time in a long time where he could permit himself the luxury of concentration. While we do not know for certain about this particular night, Tad usually fell asleep in his father's study, and eventually Lincoln would pick up the boy and carry him to bed. But once Lincoln was alone and settled into the enveloping silence, what went through his mind? Robert Lincoln, said his mother before her retiring, repeated her opposition to the proclamation. But even then, Lincoln, in reply, had not revealed his intentions. He simply paced, pausing once in a while to read a few favorite verses from the Bible and to gaze through the White House window at the night sky. The 6 months preceding this had been transformative for him. He had built a career on reason and argument, on the powers of human agency to effect change. His entire life was an example of that Enlightenment creed, a self-educated backwoodsman of questionable birth whose literary, oratorical, and political labors brought him to the greatest of heights. Yet the awful war and the exasperating task of ending slavery had reawakened in him a humbling respect for the unreasonable, for what he did not know and for what he could not know. It was uncanny. The same sort of personal epiphany had occurred around all the challenges of his life. He had trusted the war to men who plotted the movements of troops and artillery with slide rules and diagrams, yet they had failed. And now, in light of their own failure, he leaned toward a more muscular, less cerebral war, one that permitted any act deemed to be of military necessity, any act that furthered the intended aims of the war. He believed in a gradual, peaceful, and compensated path to the extinction of slavery, one that took into account the interest of both slaveholders and slaves, that rejected the riskiness of sudden emancipation with its harsh rebuke and potential for violence, yet here he was, hours away from freeing the slaves, not by the construction of some deliberate and measured plan vetted by the legislative process, but by presidential fiat announced from the barrel of a gun. An attorney, he had believed firmly in the law as the governing force of a just society, yet he had stretched the boundaries of the Constitution, first in suspending civil liberties and now in the document that awaited his signature, the seizing of private property without statutory authority. Yes, it was an act of war, and yes, this property was different in that it breathed the air and walked the earth, but it was property and people, not things. But there remained the question whether Lincoln was interpreting the law to serve the outcome he wanted, rather than for what the law said. Ironically, for someone accused of such a bold-faced grab for power, Lincoln had privately moved increasingly toward a submission to the will of something greater than himself. The idea was by no means new for him. Indeed, it recalled his youthful profession of interest in the doctrine of necessity, which asserted that there was no free will, that one's actions were directed by some exterior force in the fulfillment of an eternal yet essentially unknowable design. Lincoln may have described this force as the Almighty God, and indeed his references to providence and the divine being increased as the conditions of the war and his presidency got worse, but it was the same God he had contemplated in his September 1862 meditation on the divine will. God as a force of inevitability, of cause and effect, of the working out of a process only he could understand. In this design, man was nothing more than an instrument in a process compelled to feel, think, will, and to act by this vast world machine working in grooves and moving in deep, cut channels forever and forever. Lincoln's philosophy, wrote his law partner, William Herndon, was the source of his legendary grace and humility. For if men are, quote, mere tools in the hands of fate, made as they are by conditions, then to praise them or blame them was pure folly. This philosophy stressed equality. Ironically, the president upon whom so many great men theories of American history depends saw himself as no different from anyone else. No one was less or more responsible for the conditions of the world than the next person, because all were helpless to change events as they were directed from above. When Mary and Robert arrived in Lincoln's study in the morning, asking him what he had decided, the president looked up at them, a great light illumining his face, and answered, "I am a man under orders. I cannot do otherwise." And finally, I'd like to read to you from a quote that, more than anything else, inspired me to write this book. It comes from the great African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois. Abraham Lincoln was a Southern poor white of illegitimate birth, poorly educated, unusually ugly, awkward, and ill-dressed, Du Bois claimed in a 1922 issue of the NAACP magazine Crisis. He liked smutty stories and was a politician down to his toes. We would all like to think that a man's education experience forms a progressive line. The more he learns, the better he is. This is only natural, said Du Bois. A desire to whitewash our heroes, to remember only the fine and the brave and the good about those we revere and to whom we look for guidance. We yearn in our imperfection towards perfection. Sinful, we envisage righteousness. But life is rarely so cleanly lived. And in our lifting up of those we admire, we forget, Du Bois wrote, all that was small and mean and unpleasant, rendering the image of our forebears remote, immense, perfect, cold, and dead. Drawing on his own words, he might also have said that we remove the notion that we could become them, that the great are no greater than us. This book represents an in-between moment for Lincoln. He is not yet the revered God he would become, yet the awful responsibility that has been thrust upon him means that he is already history's object to mold. He is both racist and not. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation and then withdraws it, resubmits it, and then offers to take it away. An agnostic, he prays for God's mercy. A constitutionalist, he suspends one of the most treasured civil liberties. A man of principle, he displays a coarse willingness to compromise. In the task of freeing men and women, he becomes a tyrant. He is Lincoln, and he was human. I love Lincoln, concluded Du Bois, not because he was perfect, but because he was not and yet triumphed. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll take any questions anybody might have. There's microphones on the side of the seats here if you'd like to step out, and comments as well. We'll start over here.
Thank you very much.
Please tell me your name as you...
My name is Robin White, and I'd like to ask you about what was happening in April of that year with D.C. emancipation. And I have here one of those unpublished letters from great-grandpa Dr. Breed of the Massachusetts Volunteers, who was here at the Circle Hospital. He had a congressman cousin, and they just dropped by the White House on April 15th. He has a lot to say about how slovenly Lincoln looked. But General Wilson came in and pressed him to sign a bill that he'd had only 2 days, and he expressed some exasperation that he had 10 days to sign it. And the congressman said, does this not meet with the terms of your recommendation? And if you don't mind me quoting, "No," said Lincoln, "it does not. It does not provide a vote for the people of the district, and it is sudden and not gradual emancipation. What was the necessity of this sudden action? God knows I wish to see every slave in the land free, but we have got a mighty work on our hands. If the border states leave us, we can never accomplish it. And it is a serious question whether these exciting questions should be thrust before us quite at this period." So I'll be happy to share this letter with you later.
I'd love to see it.
Because it's a fascinating one. We have over 1,000 letters between he and his wife.
Of course, the period for this book is July to December, but the mood, the attitude you describe of Lincoln's in April was consistent with what he was for much of the summer. And he is alternately, one of the wonderful things about Lincoln is he plays out all the arguments vocally. I mean, there's this wonderful scene where he invites, I think it's James Speed, to the White House just so he can sit there, and he actually delivers the arguments for and against emancipation to him, not asking him to comment, but he just wants to sort of have them voiced from him so he can hear them, and having someone present as an audience change the way that he would hear it. And he was doing this all through the summer. There were other places in which he would actually play out the argument against emancipation. Then he'd play out the argument for emancipation. But I think what you can tell from that letter, would seem to me, is just how far he went from April to January. And therefore understand how much trepidation he would have had, because this was not a gradual shift of his position. This was a radical turn by the time he got to January. And you can understand, therefore, why he went back and forth, because it was such a radical turn. I'd love to take a look at that. Thank you for bringing it up. I appreciate it. Yes.
So I was
What's your
intrigued
name
that Mrs. Lincoln was...
What's your name first? Can I get your name?
Oh, I'm sorry. Jim Lowen. I'm the author of a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me about American history and how we get it wrong in our high school history textbooks. And you said that Mrs. Lincoln was against the Emancipation Proclamation, or his offering it. Yet she was good friends with Charles Sumner and maybe better on slavery at times than he. Why was she against it?
Well, I didn't study why she was against it. I just know that when she came into the study that morning, she expressed her opinion that being against it. Frankly, I don't know the story of Mary well enough to know that. I'll have to read one of your books to find out.
Hi, my name is Emily. Thank you for your wonderful talk. I'm from Peoria, Illinois, so thanks for the shout out to Peoria. I had two questions, a two-parter. One is based on what we grew up with in our learning of Lincoln. Most parts he's considered a hero. What did you find the most difficult in your research of reconciling yourself to that heroic image versus his back and forth on these issues?
I found, his pessimism about a future America as a biracial country to be the most disturbing to me. I had always thought of him as very forward-thinking and an idealist in some respects, but in a way, this showed a kind of defeatism that I had not expected to see from Lincoln. The tough thing about studying Lincoln is that while there have been so many books written about him, the primary sources are pretty flimsy, and there's a lot of confusing source material. Books that were written shortly after he died by people who claimed that they knew him, who really had agendas of one sort or another they wanted to push. One of the books that is most relied upon for the story of the Emancipation Proclamation is written by an artist, Francis Carpenter, who did a painting that's still in the Capitol over here called The First Reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. He moved into the White House for 6 months to actually conduct to do his work, painting the various members of the cabinet who were there for the reading. And he wrote a book afterwards about what Lincoln said to him when he was there. Now, he was not a historian, he was not a journalist, he was a painter, he overheard things. I don't think we have any record that he wrote down notes, so he was doing it off the top of his head. Lincoln was speaking well after the fact, so he might have wanted to seem more confident about his reasoning of why he signed the Emancipation Proclamation when he did. So it's hard to really trust the material from that source. But on the other hand, it's one of the only sources we have about what really happened, and it comes indirectly from Lincoln's mouth. As I mentioned before, the reference that Robert Todd Lincoln mentions about him staying up all night, pretty tantalizing fact, except that he didn't reveal it until almost the 1920s. You sort of wonder why it would have taken him so long, and if so, and it was also revealed to a friend who then revealed it to somebody at the Christian Science Monitor who then published it. Well, that's also a circuitous route, right?
Interesting.
So you don't know what's lost and what's enhanced from going from one source. My introduction referred to the fact that I've done a lot of work in oral history, which is itself a suspect medium for understanding history because the memory is such that it enhances and detracts and does things to cope with what's happened, right? And it also passes on from one view to another, and suddenly you've got this sort of warped image that everybody was at Woodstock, right? But I found that reflecting on that, maybe he wasn't quite the pessimist that we're making him out to be. Maybe maybe some of these original source materials remain suspect about it. But I found that his pessimism with respect to the colonization was just hard for me to reconcile with the Lincoln that I had felt I'd known. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
How about you? What do you feel about Lincoln?
I appreciate what this gentleman too said about the history as you grow up, because coming from Illinois, the land of Lincoln, Lincoln was Illinois' son as opposed to Kentucky and Indiana. Everybody claimed him, but you grew
I
up
come
with.
from Indiana. He's really from Indiana.
Okay, all right, I'll concede that. That you really do think of them as one-dimensional, and you want to believe that this humble man of those origins could come up and have this amazing career and ability and people skill. And then when you go further into the research, you do get a little disappointed, but then in a way, it makes you think that the common person can also achieve great things too, so you kind of see it as half full, hopefully. And I wonder how much influence Lincoln had by his cabinet members, and then in his solitude, as you referenced, that he really could grapple with what he thought, and then you say the right thing to do, the political thing to do, whatever the expedient thing to do is, you kind of have to question all of that. But thank goodness that it worked out.
Yes.
And then the second part, if I may, is what parallels do you see with his executive decision for emancipation given today's status?
I knew that
Thanks.
one was going to come up.
Thank you.
I did some research into, there's actually something called the Proclamations Project at the University of Texas or University of Houston, I forget which one. And proclamation, executive order, they had sort of more, proclamation today tends to be a very ceremonial thing. I think every day is a different, it's declared as the whatever group day, so there's a lot of proclamations that have more of a ceremonial character now. Members of his cabinet wondered whether he needed to even issue a proclamation, particularly Secretary of Treasury Chase. He felt that let the Union Army free the slaves as they march into the South. Let them be an army of liberation. We'll issue it as a tactic of the conduct of the war, but we don't need to essentially broadcast it, bring attention to it. And in so doing, we won't risk as much because the political backfire from it will not be as rich. I think he had a point at a very practical level, but I think it may also, and I don't have a lot to base this on, but it may also show something about Lincoln's understanding of public relations, you might even argue, that he knew that by issuing a proclamation of emancipation, that there would never be any turning back. Whereas if it had just been a tactic of the Army as it marched into the South, that it would have been less adhesive in a certain way. I'll come to you, but you have been waiting in line here, so let's hear from you next. What is your name?
John.
John,
Yeah,
okay.
thank you. I think your talk really helped me, because I've always been exasperated, because I think you can read different books about Lincoln, and one will emphasize this and another that, and I think you can find anything you want to believe about him, you can find a quote from him that will support it, as you pointed out. I think one of the things I read is when he was practicing law in Springfield, his opponents would say he would stand up and give their side, in his summation, give their side so well that they thought they didn't even need to give it, because and then he would turn around and give the other side so well. And so he was very good at seeing all sides of all problems, and then voicing it, giving voice to it, which I suppose is one of your points, that's why there's so much out there that's so contradictory. Yeah. But one thing that really struck me, and that I wanted you to address, Sherman said that when he first met Lincoln at the very beginning of the war, he wasn't impressed with him at all. He thought of him as sort of a political hack who just was always so politically tuned in to everything that he would, which ways are things leaning? We can't do this, we can't do that, because, what do the people think? And he thought he didn't have any backbone. And then he met him at the end of the war, and he said, it's like I met somebody totally different, a man of profound destiny and depth that I had not, that had either it had grown or I just didn't see it. Do you think that he really evolved during the war to a different plateau?
Well, several comments. To the first part of your question, one of the things I tried very hard to do in this book, which is a book I'm very proud of, and it's a very personal book for me, was to reject what a friend of mine, a wonderful historian named Fred Siegel, refers to as plumb line histories, where you drop a line down and you attach the things that fit your theory, you reject the things that don't because they could get in the way, and then you have your point of view. And how that negates the richness of the historical landscape. You know, we need to present all the confusing elements in a sense, and tie them together in a tapestry, but not reject things that don't fit. Second thing is there's a very interesting book, and only with Lincoln could you have this happen. There's a story named Don Fehrenbacher who wrote a book called Recollections. I think it's called Recollections of what Abraham Lincoln said or something like that. I probably have the title wrong. But where he goes through and he grades A through F or A through D, everything that Lincoln has claimed to have said and whether he really said it or not. And because he works from the sources and tries to understand whether the sources are legitimate or whether they have a pattern of lying or whatever it may be. And it's worth getting. You get a Kindle version of it pretty cheaply just to match some of the things you think that he said. I did do a journalist trick in the introduction to this book because I wanted to use this phrase that Lincoln is credited with saying, which is that by the age of 40, a man owns his own face, which is a wonderful phrase, I think, you know, sort of that life builds your countenance, right? Then I discovered that Fehrenbacher gave it a D. So I thought, damn, I can't use it. And I said, although it's questioned by many, Lincoln is said by some to have said. The next thing about your question about whether he was more timid, less forceful early in his presidency, more forceful later. In my book, in this Lincoln's Gamble book, there's a long section about a political scientist named Francis Lieber. Have you ever heard of Francis Lieber or the Lieber Code? Yeah. When Lieber first greets Lincoln, he thinks he's just a putz. I mean, he just thinks doesn't have anything to lead a war. Because Lieber is very forceful about wanting to lead a hard war, as he says. And by the time that Lieber writes his code, works with Henry Halleck, and ends up becoming an integral part of the war strategy and sees Lincoln adopt it, he sees tremendous growth in Lincoln as a warrior president. I think there's another interesting thought here that applies to so many political lives, and that is that Lincoln comes to the presidency maintaining that he has no interest in ending the institution of slavery. We all know that, right? 2 years later, he ends the institution of slavery. So you could say he's a politician who breaks his promises. Or you could say he's a man who, once he got into office, learned certain things, adapted to certain things, and made decisions that may have countered something he felt when he first arrived, but he no longer felt. And I would think we'd want the latter version of the presidency to prevail, simply because you don't want people to stop thinking when they arrive in office, and you want to see them grow and develop. And this is a common theme of Lincoln histories, is that he was educable, that he grew, that he developed. That we certainly know that he's this wonderful example of someone who was constantly enriching in his reading and his experience. He goes out and tests out one of the repeater rifles while he's president one day. There's also this wonderful site. I mean, the internet's a fabulous place for Lincoln, because you go there, you can see Lincoln day by day. You can look so every day of the week, any day of the year, you go see what was Lincoln doing on September 12th, 1864 or whatever, and it'll have all this very sort of minor stuff. At the same time, it's got the major stuff, like there's there's this wonderful moment when some descendant of Henry Clay gives him Henry Clay's snuff box and arrives and waits outside and gives it to him. And you see this in the movie Lincoln, actually, him meeting with people who are just ordinary citizens coming to complain about something. So the answer to your question, of course, we don't know. We don't know what we only know what these little bits and pieces. I would suspect any man would grow, any woman would grow in the White House through experience, and in particular this president, because of his zest for knowledge. Yes, sir.
A wonderful talk.
What's your name?
Stephen Shore. Two points. The first, a minor point. I was unaware if there was any doubt about Lincoln's legitimacy, his birth being illegitimate, being legitimate, and the more important point was the diplomatic aspect. that emancipation essentially trumped any possibility of British or French recognition or of the Confederacy and intervention in the American Civil War, barring actually a tremendous, barring an annihilation of the Union Army by General Lee.
Yes, and of course Seward was vocal about that in meetings with the cabinet and meetings with Lincoln. Among the books that I did not mention that were written by Lincoln is one called The Paternity of Abraham Lincoln, with the unfortunate subtitle, An Essay on the Chastity of Nancy Hanks. So there was this question, and it remains, actually, if you do a Google search, you'll see there's still a question about, I think of a Google search, you can prove just about anything, right? But there's still a lot of speculation about Lincoln's paternity. Yes, sir. What's your name?
My name's Rick Gamble, and I share a birthday with Honest Abe.
Rick Gamble. Well,
so I want to personally thank you for the greatest title in my book library.
There's actually somebody, believe it or not, I discovered on Facebook, somebody sent it to me, named Lincoln Gamble.
Okay. Just like to paraphrase William Faulkner and remind people that the past isn't dead, it's not even past, that as we stand here and talk about Lincoln and the Civil War, within the hour down the street at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the President will be awarding the Congressional Medal of Honor to a young artillery officer who gave the last full measure of devotion staring down Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. So it's remarkable to come here. My question is, you kept talking about Lincoln working in solitude on this. Do you suspect or do we know, did he run any drafts by anyone that he bounced ideas off of? And related, when did he become intimate with Frederick Douglass? Was that during this process or after the?
It was afterwards when he became intimate with Frederick Douglass, although Douglass responded somewhat suspiciously to what was going on in the White House in 1862, particularly when he invites this delegation of black leaders to come to lead, asking them to lead a colonization movement outside the country. Thomas Eckert, I believe it is, who was the sort of the chief clerk in the telegraph office, was aware of the writing of the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't believe he actually consulted with him on the wording, although it wouldn't be unlike Lincoln to turn to somebody who was not a lawyer and not involved in policy making to ask him his opinion. But he did say to Eckert, I don't want anybody to see this. If you wish to look at it, that's fine, and you can read it, but I don't want anybody else looking. As he locked it up in his drawer each night. Then, of course, the first draft is issued when he reads it to the cabinet in the end of July. And there's when the back of the book, there are copies of each of the iterations of the Emancipation Proclamation. They're very interesting to study one against the other. And then also to read some of the historical record about things that were introduced by Lincoln that he was encouraged to pull out. At one point he put that the emancipation will only last during the term of the president incumbent. And like Seward and Case were, are you kidding me? I mean, how could you say that this would expire upon the end of your term? That's just, and I think he was, of course, thinking of the issues attached to its temporal nature, that he needed to address. Of course, in the movie, Lincoln addresses the 13th Amendment and his urgency for that. The only moments of quote-unquote poetry or sort of higher purpose come in the very last version, the one that he signs, where he refers to, at the encouragement of Secretary of Treasury Chase, that he encourages the line that it's an act of justice looked upon by the grace of the Almighty, or something. I don't have the exact phrase there, but that, in other words, he introduces God into the document and introduces the notion that it's just to free the slaves, not only a war measure, not only to end slavery, but is the right thing to do. It's the only moment he actually mentions that within any of the versions of the document.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the end. I just have to point out my sister-in-law, who's sitting in the audience here. It's her birthday today, and I want you all to wish her birthday, happy birthday on the way out. I appreciate all of you coming, and if you do read the book, I hope you'll go to my website, which is lincolnsgamble.com, and sign the guest book and send me a note. Let me know what you think about it. We'll start a discussion. I am eager to get any kind of feedback. But thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. And I'll be signing over there across the hallway, too.